The Seven Shadow Kings, the origin of the dynasty of shadows before fear was understood. There were 7 kings, 7 rulers who once walked as men, but were claimed by something older than darkness. Each one wears a color, and each color is a fear we try to hide. Yellow, madness; red, blood; blue, forgetting; green, decay; black, silence; purple, prophecy; white, judgment. In this video, you will witness their origin, the birth of the dynasty of shadows. But understand this, they were not born monsters, they became them.
Before memory had a name, before fear had a face, there were 7 kings. They were men once, rulers of mortal realms, each haunted by a fear they could not conquer. In their hunger for dominion, they reached beyond the veil of life, and what they touched changed them forever. Thus was born the dynasty of shadows, 7 monarchs who became the living essence of terror itself. They are not gods. They are echoes of humanity's oldest truths. They are the 7 dark kings. In the age when the world was young and men still believed themselves masters of their fate, there existed 7 kingdoms that had never known defeat. Each was ruled by a monarch whose name was spoken with reverence across continents, whose wisdom was sought by philosophers, whose military prowess was studied by generals, and whose wealth made merchants weep with envy. Yet for all their glory, each king harbored within his breast a fear that gnawed at him in the darkest hours of night, a terror so profound that it eclipsed even the spectre of death itself. The first was King Astha of the Golden Citadel, whose intellect blazed so brilliantly that scholars traveled for years merely to hear him speak. But Astha lived in constant dread of the day when his mind might betray him, when the crystalline clarity of his thoughts might cloud and fragment. He feared madness above all things, and in that fear he planted the seed of his own undoing. The second was King Ratha of the Crimson Plains, a warrior without equal whose passion burned like a funeral pyre. He had conquered nations through sheer force of will, yet he feared the cooling of his blood, the day when desire might abandon him and leave only hollow victory. He dreaded a life without hunger, without the intoxicating rush of battle and conquest. The third was King Martha of the Sapphire Coast, whose archives contained the sum of human knowledge, whose libraries stretched for miles beneath mountains of stone. But Martha feared forgetting, the slow erosion of memory, the loss of all he had learned and loved. He watched his elderly counselors slip into confusion and felt horror at the thought of his own magnificent mind becoming an empty vessel. The fourth was King Vartha of the Emerald Valleys, whose lands were so fertile that famine was unknown, whose gardens produced such abundance that the poor lived as well as nobles elsewhere. Yet Vartha looked upon his perfection and saw only decay waiting to claim it. He feared the inevitable rot, the corruption that turns all living things to dust, and knew that his paradise carried the seeds of its own destruction. The fifth was King Thartha of the Obsidian Mountains, a philosopher king who valued solitude and contemplation above all else. His court was silent as a tomb, for he had decreed that wisdom flourished only in quietude. But Thartha had grown so accustomed to silence that he feared the absence of all connection, the terrible loneliness that pressed upon him when he realized no one truly knew him, and he knew no one at all. The sixth was King Zartha of the Violet Isles, a prophet whose visions had saved his people from countless disasters. His foresight was legendary, his predictions never wrong. Yet Zartha feared the weight of knowledge itself, the burden of seeing futures that could not be changed, of knowing doom before it arrived, of carrying prophecies too terrible to speak aloud. The seventh was King Yartha of the Alabaster Throne, a judge so fair and incorruptible that his verdicts were considered the voice of divine justice itself. But Yartha feared his own righteousness, knowing that in his perfect judgment lay the seeds of tyranny, that in his mirror-clear assessment of right and wrong There was no room for mercy, no space for human weakness. These 7 kings, each magnificent in his way, each tormented by his fear, were bound by a prophecy none of them knew had been spoken. An oracle at the world's edge, now long dead, had whispered to the stars, 7 who fear what they are shall become what they fear, and in becoming shall rule over fear itself. It began with dreams. Across the world, in 7 separate kingdoms, 7 kings began to wake in the dark hours before dawn, their bodies drenched in sweat, their minds filled with images they could not shake. The dreams were different for each king, yet they shared a terrible similarity. In each vision, the king saw himself transformed, changed into something that was no longer quite human, something that embodied the very essence of his deepest terror. Astha dreamed of standing in a throne room where the walls were made of mirrors that reflected not his image but his thoughts made visible. He watched in horror as his ideas took shape. Beautiful at first, then fragmenting, then shattering into madness. In the dream, he smiled as his sanity crumbled, and the smile was worse than any scream. Ratha dreamed of battlefields that stretched to infinity, of himself wading through oceans of blood that rose from ankle to knee to waist to chest. In the dream, he drank deeply of the crimson tide and felt such ecstasy that waking life seemed pale and pointless by comparison. The hunger grew with every swallow, never satisfied, never complete. Martha dreamed of drowning in a sea that tasted of tears and forgotten names. Every drop of water was a memory lost, first from his subjects, then from his family, then from himself. He sank deeper and deeper, and with each fathom, another piece of his identity dissolved, until he could no longer remember why he struggled to breathe. Vartha dreamed of his gardens growing wild and terrible, of roses that bloomed and rotted in the span of a heartbeat, of fruits that turned to ash in the hand. He walked among the decay and felt profound satisfaction, as if entropy itself were a form of beauty, as if the ending of all things were the only truth worth knowing. Vartha dreamed of silence so complete it had weight and substance. It pressed against his skin like deep water, filled his lungs like smoke, entered his ears like molten lead. In the dream, he embraced this silence, became one with it, until he was no longer a man, but an absence, a void in the shape of a king. Zartha dreamed of standing at the center of infinite reflections, each showing a different future, each one terrible in its own way. He saw civilizations rise and fall, saw loved ones age and die, saw every possible outcome of every possible choice. The knowledge crushed him, and yet he reached for more, hungry for the weight of prophecy, eager for the burden of impossible foresight. Yartha dreamed of sitting in judgment over all humanity, weighing every soul, finding each one wanting. In the dream, his verdicts were absolute, his justice perfect and pitiless. He condemned millions with the same serene expression, and felt no doubt, no mercy, only the cold satisfaction of perfect righteousness. The dreams came night after night, growing more vivid, more real, until the boundary between sleep and waking began to blur. The kings grew haggard, their advisors concerned. Court physicians prescribed herbs and tonics, but nothing helped. The dreams were not illness, they were transformation. On the first night of the 7th month, when the moon hung red and swollen in the sky, all 7 kings experienced the same addition to their recurring nightmares. A voice spoke to them, ancient and patient, offering them a choice. "Your fears define you," the voice said. "They are the truest part of you, the core around which your identity has crystallized. You can continue to fight them, to deny them, to live in terror of the things you cannot control. Or you can embrace them, become them. Let your fear transform from weakness into power, from burden into crown. What would be the price?" Each king asked in his own dream, in his own way. "Only this," the voice replied. "You will cease to be wholly mortal. You will become something greater and something lesser, a living embodiment of the fear you carry. You will gain dominion over your terror, but you will also be bound to it eternally. You will rule over the hearts of men, whispering your particular darkness into every soul that shares your dread. And if we refuse, they asked, then you will die, the voice said simply. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. Your fears will consume you from within, as they have been consuming you all your lives. The weight of your dread will crush your spirit, and you will perish not from age or blade, but from the slow poison of terror itself. The choice then was no choice at all, or perhaps it was the most important choice any of them would ever make. Would you like to journey deeper into each king's domain? Let me know in the comments which Dark King intrigues you most. Subscribe to continue this journey into Shadow. And tell me, where are you watching from and which king resonated with you? Asther was the first to accept. He stood alone in his private observatory, surrounded by instruments of measurement and books of philosophy, and he spoke to the darkness. I accept. Let my fear become my crown. The change was not immediate, but it was inexorable. Over the course of 7 nights, Asther felt his mind expanding and fracturing simultaneously. His thoughts became sharper, clearer, more brilliant, and also more chaotic, more fragmented, more prone to spiraling into strange and terrible territories. He found he could see patterns that others missed, connections that linked madness to genius, relationships between ideas that should not exist. When he spoke to his advisors, they sometimes wept, sometimes laughed hysterically, sometimes stood frozen as if witnessing divine revelation. His words had gained a quality that bypassed reason and struck directly at the deepest parts of the psyche. On the 7th night, as he looked into a mirror, Asther saw his reflection shift and change. His eyes remained his own, but they held depths they had not possessed before, depths that seemed to go on forever, reflecting thoughts that folded in on themselves infinitely. His robes took on a golden hue that seemed to shift in the light, sometimes bright as the sun, sometimes pale as old parchment, sometimes tinged with the sickly color of sulfur. He had become the king in yellow, monarch of the shattered mind, and he smiled because, for the first time in his life, he was not afraid of madness. He was madness, refined and perfected and made sovereign. Ratha was the second to transform. The warrior king had always been a man of action, not contemplation. When the voice offered him power, he seized it with both hands like a sword. He wanted more of the hunger, more of the passion, more of the intoxicating rush that made life worth living. His transformation was violent and ecstatic. For 7 days and 7 nights, he neither slept nor ate, but walked the corridors of his castle with eyes that burned like embers. His courtiers fled before him, for his very presence made their hearts race, their blood pound, their most primal desires surged to the surface. On the 7th day at high noon, Ratha ascended to the roof of his highest tower and opened his veins with his own sword. But instead of dying, he laughed as crimson poured from his wounds, for he felt more alive than ever before. The blood did not drain away. It soaked into his skin, his armor, his very essence, until he was clothed in red that pulsed like a living heart. He had become the king in red, lord of the crimson throne. His hunger was eternal now, his passion infinite. Every beat of his heart was a call to violence and desire, and those who heard it found their own hearts answering in kind. Martha transformed slowly, like a tide creeping up ashore. The Scholar King spent his final days as a mortal, walking through his vast libraries, running his fingers over the spines of countless books, trying to commit every page to memory. But the harder he tried to remember, the more he felt himself forgetting. Names slipped away first, then faces, then entire histories. He wept as he felt his identity dissolving, but he did not fight it. He had made his choice. On the 7th night, he walked into the sea that bordered his kingdom and did not stop when the water rose over his head. He sank deep, deeper than any man should be able to dive, down to places where light never reached. There, in the absolute darkness of the ocean's depths, he completed his transformation. When he emerged, his robes were the blue of deep water. and his eyes held the emptiness of the abyss. He could no longer remember his own birth name, but he knew himself as Martha, the king in blue, sovereign of the drowned memory. Every wave that touched his shore carried away another fragment of the past, and he reveled in the erasure. Vartha's transformation was a thing of terrible beauty. The king of the fertile valleys spent his final week as a mortal, watching his perfect gardens with new eyes. He no longer saw the flowers in bloom. He saw the bloom ending, saw the inevitable decay that waited within every petal. And for the first time he found it beautiful. He walked through his orchards and laid his hand on the trees, and where he touched, the fruit ripened, fell, and rotted in minutes. The rot spread like a benediction, turning the harvest to mulch, then to rich soil, then to something beyond death, a state of perfect entropy where all potential had been exhausted. On the seventh day, Vartha sat upon his throne and simply stopped fighting. He let the decay he had always feared wash over him, through him, and instead of destroying him, it remade him. His flesh took on a greenish tint, like copper oxidizing, like spring grass slowly dying into autumn. His robes became the color of moss and mold, and growing things returning to earth. He had become the king in green, master of the rotting garden. Now he understood that decay was not the enemy of life, but its necessary companion, that without entropy there could be no change, no growth, no transformation. In death he had found a kind of immortality. Vartha's change was the most subtle. The Silent King simply became more of what he had always been. He dismissed his court, sent away his servants, and sat alone in his obsidian palace for 7 days and 7 nights. With each passing hour, the silence grew deeper, more profound, more absolute. On the 7th night, a servant brave enough to check on the king opened the throne room doors and found nothing. The room was empty, the throne unoccupied. But when he tried to call out, his voice made no sound. When he tried to run, his footsteps were utterly silent. The silence had gained substance, had become a presence that filled the space where the king should have been. And then the servant saw him, or rather, felt his presence. Vartha stood in the shadows, but he was no longer a man who stood in silence. He was the silence itself, given form and consciousness. His robes were the black of absolute void, absorbing all sound, all vibration, all connection. He had become the king in black, lord of the hollow court. In his presence, even hearts beat silently, even screams died unheard. He had achieved the perfect solitude he had always craved, and found it more terrible than he had ever imagined. Vartha's transformation nearly broke him. The prophet king had always seen glimpses of the future, but as he accepted the voice's offer, those glimpses became an avalanche. Every possible future, every alternate timeline, every consequence of every choice, all of it flooded into his mind at once. For 7 days, he lay in a fever, his body convulsing, his eyes rolled back in his head. His scribes recorded his ravings, prophecies of empires not yet born, of catastrophes centuries away, of personal tragedies that would befall people who had not yet been conceived. The weight of knowledge should have destroyed him utterly, but on the 7th day, something changed. Vartha's eyes opened, now a deep purple like a bruise or a twilight sky, and he stood calmly. The visions did not stop. They would never stop. But he had learned to carry them. More than that, he had learned to shape them, to choose which futures he would whisper into the world and which he would hold silent. He had become the king in purple, master of the Veil of Echoes. Every reflection showed him possibilities, every shadow held prophecies, and he walked between what was and what might be with the surety of a man who had already lived 1,000 lifetimes. Vartha was the last to transform, and his change was the most painful. The Judge King had always prided himself on his fairness, his impartiality, his unwavering sense of justice. But as he accepted the voice's offer, he began to see clearly truly clearly for the first time. He saw the guilt that lurked in every heart, the sins that every soul carried, the compromises that every person made just to survive. He saw his own sins, too, reflected and magnified. He saw how his perfect justice had sometimes been cruelty in disguise, how his righteousness had crushed as many spirits as it had elevated. He saw himself clearly, and in that clarity he found no absolution. For 7 days, Yatha sat in judgment over himself, examining every choice he had ever made, every verdict he had ever pronounced. He found himself guilty 1,000 times over, but he also found himself innocent of nothing but being human. Flawed, limited, trying his best in an imperfect world. On the 7th day, he stood before a mirror and passed judgment on his own soul. He found himself both worthy and damned, both innocent and guilty, both merciful and merciless. The contradiction should have paralyzed him, but instead it liberated him. His robes turned white, but it was not the white of purity. It was the white of emptiness, of a canvas waiting to receive every color, every stain. He had become the king in white, sovereign of the pale citadel. His gaze now held the weight of perfect judgment, and all who met it saw themselves reflected as they truly were. No better, no worse, simply true. The transformation complete. The 7 kings ruled their mortal kingdoms for one final generation. It was an age of wonders and terrors, when the boundary between the mundane and the supernatural grew thin and permeable. In Astha's golden citadel, philosophy and art reached heights never before achieved. Poets composed verses that drove men to tears or laughter or enlightenment with equal frequency. Architects designed buildings that seemed to defy geometry itself, towers that twisted in impossible ways, yet stood firm. But there was a price. Madness spread like a plague. 1 in 10 citizens heard voices that others could not, saw patterns that did not exist, felt their grip on reality loosening day by day. The king in yellow walked among his people, touching minds with whispers that sounded like their own thoughts. He showed them the beauty in chaos, the genius in madness, the thin line between revelation and insanity. Those he favored became legendary artists and philosophers. Those he did not favor simply shattered, their minds fragmenting into pieces that could never be reassembled. Madness, Astha said to his most trusted advisor, is simply seeing the truth that others refuse to acknowledge. Reality is not solid. It is liquid, malleable, held in shape only by the collective agreement of millions of minds, all insisting that things must be a certain way. I merely show people what happens when that agreement dissolves. In Ratha's crimson plains, every passion was amplified, every desire made manifest. Wars were fought over slights that would once have been ignored. Lovers' quarrels ended in murder. But there was also unprecedented vitality. Art, music, dance, all the expressions of human passion flourished. People lived intensely briefly, burning themselves out like candles lit at both ends. The king in red led his armies in campaigns of conquest, not for territory, but for the sheer joy of battle. He took no pleasure in victory, only in the struggle itself. His soldiers worshipped him, for in his presence they felt truly alive, their blood singing with purpose. But the campaigns grew more brutal, more senseless, until warfare became an end unto itself, divorced from any rational goal. Life without hunger is not life, Ratha told his generals as they surveyed a battlefield where both armies had fought to mutual extinction. It is merely existence. I've given my people the gift of desire, and if that desire consumes them, at least they will have lived before they died. In Martha's realm, an eerie peace descended. People went about their lives with strange contentment, for they no longer remembered their grudges, their sorrows, their losses. The king in blue walked the shores of his kingdom, and the tide that followed him washed away pain and memory in equal measure. At first it seemed a blessing. The bereaved forgot their grief. The wronged forgot their anger. Ancient feuds dissolved, as the descendants of enemies could no longer remember why their families had hated each other. But slowly, the people began to forget everything, not just the painful memories, but the joyful ones too. They forgot their children's names, their own histories, the stories that had defined their culture for generations. Memory, Martha said to the blank-faced citizens who stood on the shore, is a burden that humanity was never meant to bear. You cling to the past as if it defines you, but all it does is weigh you down. I offer erasure, and in erasure, freedom. In Vartha's emerald valleys, the gardens grew wild and glorious, blooming and dying in accelerated cycles. Nothing remained perfect for long. Flowers rotted even as they blossomed, fruit fermented on the branch. Buildings crumbled as they were constructed. The people learned to appreciate beauty in its moment of transition. To see the artistry in decay, the king in green cultivated his rotting garden with loving care, understanding that every ending contained the seeds of a new beginning. His kingdom became a place of constant change, nothing static, nothing permanent. Some found this liberating. Others found it horrifying to watch everything they built dissolve before their eyes. Creation and destruction are not opposites. Vartha explained to his architects as another palace slowly crumbled into artistic ruin. They are partners in an eternal dance. Without decay, nothing new can grow. Without death, life has no meaning. I teach acceptance of the cycle. In Thartha's obsidian mountains, silence reigned absolute. The king in black had withdrawn so completely into isolation that some doubted he still existed. Yet his presence was felt everywhere, in the lonely hours of night, in the moments when words failed, in the growing distance between people who could not find ways to connect. Communication itself became difficult in his realm. People found it harder to speak, harder to write, harder to express what was in their hearts. The silence was not peaceful. It was oppressive, a weight that pressed down on every social interaction. Families ate dinner in uncomfortable quiet. Lovers lay beside each other, unable to voice their feelings. The kingdom became a place of profound loneliness, even in crowds. Connection is an illusion, Thartha's last recorded words proclaimed, before he ceased speaking entirely. Every soul is fundamentally alone, and the sooner we accept that truth, the sooner we can stop pretending otherwise. I offer the gift of honest isolation. In Zartha's violet isles, prophecy became a curse. The king in purple granted visions freely, showing people glimpses of possible futures. Some saw great successes and worked to achieve them. Others saw terrible failures and grew paralyzed by fear. Most saw both and lost the ability to make any choice at all, frozen by the weight of knowledge. The gift of foresight spread through the population like a disease. Farmers saw droughts before they came and abandoned their fields. Merchants saw the collapse of trade routes and hoarded their goods. Lovers saw future betrayals and ended relationships before they began. Knowing what might come, the people of the Violet Isles became unable to live in the present. The future is not fixed, Zartha told his seers, even as he showed them visions that suggested otherwise. Every prophecy contains its own contradiction. Every certainty holds the seed of change. But knowledge once gained cannot be forgotten. This is my gift and my curse. I show you what awaits and let you decide whether to walk toward it or away. In Yartha's alabaster throne, justice became absolute and therefore terrible. The king in white saw into every heart, weighed every soul, and pronounced judgment without mercy or malice, simply truth. In his realm, no crime went unpunished, no virtue unrewarded. But the judgments were often harsh, for he saw people as they truly were, not as they wished to be. The people lived in constant awareness of their own failings, for Yartha's gaze was everywhere, reflected in every polished surface, every still pool of water, every clear pane of glass. They saw themselves as he saw them, honestly, completely, without the comfortable illusions that make daily life bearable. Some strove for perfection, most simply broke under the weight of their own imperfection. I do not punish, Yartha said, when his advisors begged him to show leniency. I merely reflect. If people suffer under my judgment, it is because they suffer under the weight of their own truth. I am a mirror, nothing more. But I am a mirror that shows everything, without distortion, without mercy, without lies. The mortal kingdoms could not sustain the presence of the 7 dark kings indefinitely. The transformations that had made them powerful had also made them incompatible with the mundane world. Reality itself began to reject them, like a body rejecting a foreign organ. Astha felt it first. His madness had grown so profound that ordinary minds could no longer comprehend him. When he spoke, people's ears bled. When he wrote, the ink writhed off the page and formed symbols that burned themselves into readers' eyes. His very existence had become a hazard to sanity itself. The others felt it too, each in their own way. Rotha's hunger had grown so intense that his presence caused spontaneous violence. Martha's erasure had become so complete that he could no longer remember his own name from one moment to the next. Vartha's touch accelerated decay so rapidly that stone crumbled at his footstep. Thartha's silence had deepened until even he could no longer perceive the world around him. Zartha's visions had multiplied until he saw every possible future simultaneously and could no longer distinguish between them. Yatha's judgment had become so perfect that he could no longer see anything but sin and virtue, with no humanity between. They were becoming concepts rather than beings, embodiments rather than individuals. The mortal world could not contain them, and so one by one they left. Astha was the first to go. He simply stopped being in one place and started being everywhere and nowhere. The shattered mind became a place that existed between thoughts, a realm accessible only to those who had lost their grip on sanity. His golden citadel dissolved like a dream upon waking, leaving behind only rumors and legends and the occasional person whose eyes held too much knowledge and too little reason. The shattered mind is not a place that can be reached by ship or horse, by map or compass. It exists in the space between rational thought and broken consciousness, accessible only to those whose grip on reality has already begun to loosen. Those who enter Astha's realm seldom do so by choice. They slip into it the way one slips into a fever dream, barely aware of the transition until they are already lost. The Hall of Infinite Mirrors stands at the center of everything. It is not a building so much as a concept made architectural, a space where every surface reflects not what is, but what might be, what should be, what cannot be, but is, anyway. The mirrors breathe, their surfaces rippling like water disturbed by invisible stones. Each reflection shows a different version of the viewer, and none of them are quite right. A scholar who entered the hall seeking knowledge saw himself in 1,000 mirrors. In one, he was a beggar mumbling equations in the gutter. In another, a god whose thoughts shaped galaxies. In the third, a child who had never learned to speak. In a fourth, a mouth with no body screaming theorems into the void. He tried to look away, but every direction held more mirrors, more versions, more possibilities of himself splintering into infinite variations. Which one is real? He asked the empty air. All of them, came Astha's voice from everywhere and nowhere. None of them. The question itself is flawed. You assume there is one true you, one coherent self. But consciousness is a lie we tell ourselves to pretend we're not a million competing impulses wearing a single skin. The Garden of Screaming Thoughts is exactly what its name suggests. A landscape park where ideas have gained physical form and terrible independence. They manifest as plants, as sculptures, as animals, as weather patterns. A simple notion like, what if I'm not good enough, appears as a vine that wraps around the ankles and whispers inadequacy with every tightening coil. An artist who wandered into the garden found her own creative doubts made manifest as birds with human faces, her own face screaming criticism in her own voice. They followed her through the twisted paths, dive-bombing whenever she tried to think clearly. Make them stop, she begged Astha, who appeared beside her as a figure in yellow robes that hurt to look at directly. Would you like to journey deeper into each king's domain? Let me know in the comments which Dark King intrigues you most. Subscribe to continue this journey into Shadow. And tell me, where are you watching from and which king resonated with you? Why would I do that? The king in yellow asked. These are yours. You made them, fed them with your attention over years of self-doubt. I merely gave them the courtesy of visibility. Before, they attacked you in silence. Now at least you can see your enemies. At the heart of the shattered mind stands the court of the Yellow King. It is more like the inside of a skull made architectural, a space where the walls pulse with the rhythm of thoughts, where the floor shifts beneath feet like synapses firing. Aster holds court here, but he does not simply sit upon a throne. He exists in multiple states at once, sitting, standing, pacing, gesturing, still as death, frantic with motion. Sometimes he appears as a single figure in yellow robes. Sometimes he fractures into a dozen versions of himself, each one continuing a different thread of conversation. A young woman stood before him, brought to this place by a breakdown she could not explain, a slow dissolution of her sense of self. "Why am I here?" she asked, though her lips did not move. "Because you are ready." Aster's response came from multiple directions at once. "Because you called out, even if you did not know you were calling. Because the walls you built to protect your sanity have worn thin enough that you could finally slip through." "I didn't want this," she protested. "Understanding and madness are the same thing, child," Aster said. "Sanity is simply agreeing to remain ignorant about certain fundamental truths. The universe does not make sense. Consciousness is a paradox. The self is a fiction. To truly understand these things is to go mad. To go mad is to finally see clearly." "What did you choose when you stood where I'm standing now?" she finally asked. Aster's many forms converged into one, and for a moment he looked almost human, a man haunted by the weight of knowledge he could not share, could not escape, could not unsee. "I chose truth," he said softly. "I became the king in yellow because I could not bear to live one more day in the comfortable lie. And every day since, I have regretted it and been grateful for it in equal measure. Madness is my crown and my curse." Ratha departed in a blaze of violence, leading his armies into a final battle that never ended. The Crimson Throne exists now in the moment of perfect conflict, in the eternal second between striking and being struck. The Crimson Throne is a realm of physical and emotional intensity, raised to levels that approach the divine and the demonic simultaneously. Ratha's kingdom exists in the perpetual moment of peak experience, the instant before the blade strikes, the heartbeat before the kiss, the breath before the scream. The realm manifests as an endless battlefield, but the war being fought is not for territory or resources or political goals. It is conflict for its own sake, violence as a form of ecstasy, combat as a meditation on mortality and vitality intertwined. Above this battlefield rises the Crimson Throne itself, a structure built from hardened blood, bone, and crystallized passion that pulses with the rhythm of the human heartbeat. A warrior who had grown weary of peacetime sought out the Crimson Throne, longing for the clarity that comes only in combat. When he arrived, he found himself on the eternal battlefield, sword in hand, surrounded by fighters whose skill eclipsed anything he had encountered in the mortal world. "Enough!" he finally gasped, dropping to his knees after fighting for what felt like days. "Enough?" Ratha appeared before him, his armor the color of arterial blood, his eyes burning with an inner fire. "You came seeking intensity, and now you say enough. You are not here to find your limits. You are here to transcend them." The king in red placed a hand on the warrior's chest, directly over his heart, and suddenly the exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of vitality so intense it was almost painful. "This is what you came for. To remember what it feels like to be fully, completely, desperately alive. The danger of the Crimson Throne is not that it destroys visitors directly, but that it makes ordinary existence intolerable by comparison. Those who spend time in Ratha's realm become addicted to intensity, unable to find satisfaction in normal pleasures, always seeking the next high, the next peak experience. People mistake me for a god of violence, Ratha told a philosopher. They see the blood and assume I revel in destruction. They are wrong. Violence is merely one form of intensity, one way to feel fully alive. I am the king of all passions, love as much as hate, joy as much as rage, desire in all its forms. I teach people to live as if they might die tomorrow because they might. I teach them to feel everything as deeply as possible, because a long life spent numb is not truly life at all. Martha walked into the sea one final time and dissolved into water, becoming the waves themselves. The drowned memory is now every ocean, every river, every tear. Wherever water flows, he is there, carrying away names and faces and loves on an endless current of forgetting. Martha's realm is perhaps the most insidious of all the 7 kingdoms, for it takes away not life or sanity or passion, but identity itself. The drowned memory is an endless ocean where every wave carries away a piece of the past, where the tide erases names and faces and stories until nothing remains but the eternal present. The sea itself is strange. Its color shifts from moment to moment. It tastes of salt and tears and something else, something indefinable that seems important but cannot quite be grasped. A woman who had come seeking release from traumatic memories found herself walking these shores. She had been assaulted years ago, and despite therapy and time, the memory remained vivid and painful. "Take it," she begged the ocean. "I don't want it anymore." A wave washed over her feet, and suddenly she could not quite remember the face of her attacker. Another wave, and the location became fuzzy. With each surge of water, another detail dissolved. But the waves did not discriminate. As they took the painful memories, they also began to erode the good ones. Her mother's face became unclear. Her childhood home lost its specificity. "Wait," she said, backing toward the shore. "Not those. I want to keep those." Martha appeared beside her, his form barely distinguishable from the mist rising off the water. The ocean does not choose. Memory is not a garden where you can pull weeds and leave flowers. It is all connected, all interwoven. To erase pain, you must also erase joy. Deep beneath the surface lie the remnants of lost civilizations, not metaphorical ruins, but actual cities of memory, built from all the things humanity has forgotten. Every abandoned custom, every dead language, every lost art and forgotten name has settled here, creating a landscape of cultural sediment that stretches for miles in every direction. A historian who sought knowledge of ancient times found himself diving deep into these waters, swimming through streets paved with forgotten names, past buildings constructed from abandoned traditions. He discovered libraries where every book was written in languages no living person could read. Museums where artifacts from civilizations that had vanished without trace were carefully displayed. "This is incredible," he breathed. "This is everything humanity has lost. This is our entire forgotten past." "Yes," Martha's voice echoed through the water. "Everything that falls through the cracks of history ends up here. But memory is not a container you can fill and carry home. The more you try to hold, the faster it slips away. Even now, you are forgetting where you came from, why you came here, what you hoped to achieve." The historian tried to argue, but already the details were blurring. He could not quite remember his own name, could not recall what university had employed him, could not bring to mind the faces of his family. He became one of the permanent residents of the underwater cities, wandering the streets in confusion, sometimes delivering lectures to empty amphitheaters about subjects he could no longer quite grasp. Not all of the drowned memory is underwater. Scattered across the endless ocean are islands, thousands of them, perhaps millions, each one representing a person who has been partially or completely forgotten by the world. a mother searching for her lost son, found herself traveling from island to island. He had died young, and with each passing year, fewer people remembered him. She feared that soon she would be the only one who carried his memory. "Which island is my son?" she asked the ferryman. "All of them," the ferryman replied. "And none of them. Your son exists in pieces now, a fragment here, a fragment there, scattered across multiple islands because different people remember different aspects of him." The mother spent what might have been years traveling the archipelago, collecting fragments, trying to hold on to everything she could. But the more she gathered, the more she felt herself fragmenting, her own identity dissolving as she spread herself across multiple islands, trying to preserve her sons. "You are forgetting yourself," Martha said when he found her. "I don't care," she replied. "As long as some part of him survives, then let me drown," she said stubbornly. "It's better than letting him disappear completely." The king in blue nodded and withdrew, leaving her to continue her work. The islands gradually merged, and the memories blended. And eventually, there was just one island where a mother and son existed in a state between remembering and forgetting, held in suspension by the power of love that refused to let go, even as the tide insisted on taking everything away. Vartha lay down in his garden and let the plants grow through him, over him, around him. The rotting garden became every place where life meets death, every compost heap and grave, and autumn forest. He is the eternal cycle, the endless wheel of growth and decay. Vartha's realm is a paradox-made landscape, a place where death and life exist, not as opposites, but as partners in an eternal dance. The rotting garden stretches as far as the eye can see, flowers blooming even as they decay, trees bearing fruit that ripens and rots simultaneously, grass that grows and withers in the same breath. The smell is overpowering at first, the sweet corruption of organic matter returning to earth. But those who remain in the garden long enough find that the smell becomes less offensive and more honest. This is what life actually smells like, stripped of the perfumes that civilization uses to disguise the fundamental truth that all living things are always in the process of dying. A gardener from the mortal world found her way to this place while grieving her dying garden. Drought had struck her region, and despite her best efforts, everything she had planted was withering. Vartha materialized beside her, his robes the color of oxidized copper and moss. "This is the garden you were always tending," he said, "but refused to see. You thought your role was to create permanence, to force plants to bloom forever. But a gardener's true work is not to prevent death. It is to facilitate transformation. I don't want my garden to die," she protested. "Your garden is not dying," the king in green replied. "It is changing. The drought has not destroyed your plants. It has transformed them. The seeds they drop will produce hardier varieties. The nutrients from their decay will enrich the soil." He knelt and plunged his hands into the soil. And where he touched, flowers erupted in accelerated growth, blooming, seeding, dying, decomposing, feeding new growth in a compressed span of seconds. This is the true beauty of a garden. Not the moment of perfect bloom, but the entire cycle. The decay is as necessary as the growth. Deep within the rotting garden lie the orchards of entropy, where fruit trees bear their bounty in all stages simultaneously. Buds and blossoms and ripe fruit and rotten windfall, all present on the same branch. The trees themselves show their history written in wood. Saplings and mature giants and hollow dead trunks all occupying the same space. A philosopher who specialized in theories of time found himself wandering these orchards. "How can something be alive and dead at once?" he demanded. "Your logic is based on the assumption that states are discrete, separate, mutually exclusive," Vartha said. "But that is not how nature works. The caterpillar does not become the butterfly. It is always the butterfly, just at different stages of manifestation. Death is not the opposite of life. It is life's continuation through different means. At the heart of the rotting garden lies the compost heap of civilizations, a mountain of cultural decay, where all the failed experiments of humanity are piled and left to decompose. Every abandoned ideology, every fallen empire, every extinct tradition ends up here, slowly breaking down into the rich soil from which new cultures will eventually grow. An archaeologist exploring this place found herself wading through layers of history made physical. She recognized pieces of her own culture in the heap, practices already falling out of use, beliefs being questioned and discarded. Everything ends up here eventually, Vartha said. Every human creation contains the seeds of its own obsolescence. But here is the beautiful part. This decay is not waste. From the compost heap of dead civilizations come the nutrients that feed new cultures. Nothing is truly lost. It is only transformed. A monk who had spent decades meditating on impermanence found his way to the rotting garden, seeking final enlightenment. Vartha met him at the gates. You seek to understand impermanence, but you still believe understanding is something you possess, rather than something that possesses you. You want to comprehend decay while remaining separate from it. That is not possible. The king in green led the monk to a patch of soil and had him lie down in it. Roots began to grow from his body, not painfully but naturally. Through those roots, the monk felt everything. Every plant dying and feeding the soil, every insect consuming and being consumed, every microbe breaking down complexity into simplicity. He felt the great cycle not as concept, but as lived experience. When Vartha finally released him, the monk stood transformed. I understand now, he said quietly. I was trying to accept impermanence while holding on to permanence. But they are not separate things. There is only transformation, and I am part of it. The monk left and lived another 30 years, teaching with a lightness and joy he had never possessed before. When death finally came for him, his final words were, "Finally, the chance to try being something else." Vartha faded so completely that no one marked his passing. The hollow court exists in every moment of isolation, every silence that stretches too long, every room where people cannot find words to bridge the gap between them. Vartha's hollow court is the realm of invisible isolation. It is the loneliest place in all the 7 kingdoms, not because it is empty, but because it is full of people who cannot reach each other. Souls separated by a silence so profound it might as well be infinite distance. The hollow court appears as an endless palace, its halls stretching in every direction. But despite its vast population, no one ever encounters anyone else in any meaningful way. You might see another person at the end of a hallway, but when you reach where they stood, they are always gone. The silence is not merely the absence of sound. It is a presence in itself, a weight that presses against the skin and fills the lungs. In this place, even screams make no noise. Written words blur and become unreadable. Signs and gestures go unnoticed. A woman who had lived her entire life surrounded by people but always feeling disconnected from them stumbled into the hollow court one night when her loneliness became too much to bear. She had family, friends, co-workers, all the trappings of social connection, but had never felt truly known by anyone. In the hollow court, that invisible wall became literal. She could see other people wandering the halls, but when she called out, her voice made no sound. When she ran toward them, they faded like mirages. "Help me," she tried to say. "Is anyone there?" "Yes," came a voice that seemed to originate from within her own skull. "I hear you." "I hear everyone, every silent scream, every unuttered word, every connection that fails to form. I am Vartha, and this is my court, the place where all your failed communications live. Why can't I reach anyone?" she asked. "Because you never could," Vartha replied. "You think this place has taken your voice, but you never truly had one. The connection you seek is an illusion, a beautiful lie that humans tell themselves. You are not here because you are uniquely isolated. You are here because you were honest enough to recognize the isolation that everyone experiences. Deep within the hollow court lies a gallery where every word that was never spoken is displayed. The walls stretch infinitely, covered with phrases that died in throats, confessions that were swallowed, apologies that never formed, declarations of love that remained. Forever internal, a writer who specialized in dialogue found himself in this gallery and realized with growing horror that real communication was not the witty exchanges of his scripts. It was this, the museum of things unsaid. He walked past display after display. "I love you," thought by a dying man about his estranged daughter, never spoken because pride got in the way. "I'm sorry," composed mentally 1,000 times but never voiced. "Help me," screamed internally by countless souls who smiled and said, "I'm fine." "This is what I should have been writing," he said. Not clever dialogue but silence. Not what people say, but what they don't say, can't say, refuse to say. Words are the least honest form of communication, Tharthar observed. They are too controlled, too shaped by consciousness and social expectation. The truest communication happens in the spaces between words, in the things that go unsaid. Language is a beautiful failure. The cruelest part of the Hollow Court is not the rooms where people are physically alone, but the chambers where people exist side by side, separated by invisible walls. These are the chambers of parallel solitude. Places where isolation is made more acute by the proximity of others who are equally isolated. A married couple found themselves in such a chamber after decades of growing apart. They could see each other clearly, could reach out and almost touch, but their hands passed through each other like smoke. They were trapped in the same space, more isolated than if they had been separated by continents. "This is what we've been living," the wife realized. "We've been in the Hollow Court for years, we just didn't recognize it. The barrier between you is made of silence," Tharthar said. "It can only be dismantled by breaking that silence, by saying all the things you've left unsaid. But understand, speaking truth after years of comfortable lies is violence. It will hurt. We have to try," they both said. Slowly, painfully, the couple began to speak, really speak, for the first time in years. They confessed disappointments and resentments. They admitted fears and failures. As they spoke, the barrier between them began to crack. It did not shatter entirely, but cracks appeared, and through those cracks, they could finally touch. They left the Hollow Court together, understanding that they would have to fight against silence every day for the rest of their lives. That the barrier would try to rebuild itself with every conversation they avoided. But at least now they knew what they were fighting against. Zartha shattered like glass, each fragment a different possible future, and then reformed in a place where all times exist simultaneously. The Veil of Echoes is the space between what is and what might be, accessible to dreamers and seers and anyone who stares too long into their own reflection. Zartha's realm exists in a state of quantum superposition, not in one timeline but in all timelines simultaneously. The Veil of Echoes is a place where every choice branches into infinite possibilities, where past, present and future exist as a single, impossibly complex tapestry. To enter the Veil of Echoes is to become unstuck in time, to see not just what is, but what might be, what could have been, what will be if certain conditions are met. Every surface reflects possible futures. Every shadow contains alternate pasts. The palace itself changes with each observation. A corridor leads to different destinations depending on what the walker is thinking, what choices they are considering, what futures they are unconsciously leaning toward. Zartha moves through this impossible architecture with ease. He exists in multiple states simultaneously, young and old, certain and doubting, victorious and defeated, all the versions of himself that might have been or might yet be, overlapping like waves in a pond. A young woman seeking knowledge of her future found her way to the Veil of Echoes through desperation. She stood at a crossroads in her life. Multiple job offers, multiple relationships, multiple paths forward, and could not choose because she feared making the wrong decision. She found herself in a hall of mirrors, but each mirror showed a different version of her life. In one reflection, she took the high-paying corporate job and rose quickly, but lost herself to burnout. In another, she pursued her art and lived in beautiful poverty. In a third, she married and had children, but always wondered about the life she could have had. Which one is right? She asked. Zartha's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Right for whom? Right by what measure? Every choice you make closes doors and opens others. Every path contains joy and regret in different proportions. There is no objectively correct future, only the one you choose and the ones you forsake. But surely some choices lead to better outcomes. Define better, the King in Purple challenged. You will be happy and unhappy in every timeline. The question is not which future is best, but which combination of joys and sorrows you are willing to accept. Then I will show you the truth of prophecy, Zartha said, and touched her forehead. Suddenly she saw them all, not as separate possibilities, but as a single overwhelming now. She lived every version of her life simultaneously, felt every joy and every regret, experienced every success and every failure in a compressed eternity that lasted less than a heartbeat but felt like lifetimes. When it ended, she collapsed, gasping. That, Zartha said quietly, is what I experience constantly. Every possible outcome, every potential choice, every branching path, all of it, all the time. You wanted certainty, but certainty is the cruelest burden I can bestow. Now you know that every choice is both right and wrong. Deep within the veil of echoes stands a library that contains every history that never happened, every war that was averted, every innovation that was never developed, every person who died before they could achieve their potential. A historian obsessed with counterfactuals found himself in this library. Here were the books he had always wanted to read. The complete works of Mozart's later years, if he had not died at 35. The second term of the Lincoln presidency, if Booth's assassination had failed. In one book, he read about a version of himself who had made different choices, who had pursued a different career, married a different person, lived a completely different life, but was equally convinced he had made the right decisions. Am I living the wrong life? He asked aloud. Zartha appeared between the shelves. You are living one life among infinite possibilities. To call it wrong implies there is a right, but there is no right. There are only the choices you made and the ones you didn't make, and both sets of choices define you equally. But I could have been happier, the historian protested. Could you? The King in Purple took the book and flipped to a later chapter. Read further. This version of you that seems so happy, see how he faces different regrets, different losses. He envies the version of you who became a historian. So there's no way to win, the historian asked bitterly. There's no way to live without regret. That is the nature of choice. Every decision means rejecting alternatives, and humans are cursed with the imagination to envision what those alternatives might have held. But here is the secret that prophets learn. The future is not fixed, but neither is the past. Every memory you have is shaped by who you are now. You can change the past by changing how you understand it, just as you can shape the future by the choices you make today. At the heart of the Veil of Echoes lies the Chamber of Prophecies, a space where all predictions, divinations, and foretellings converge. Zartha holds court in this chamber, receiving petitioners who seek knowledge of what is to come. But those who enter seeking simple answers leave with complications instead. A military commander came seeking knowledge of an upcoming battle. Zartha showed him 7 different outcomes, depending on 7 different choices he might make. Which should I choose? The commander demanded. That depends on what you value most, Zartha replied. Victory at any cost? The preservation of life? Your reputation. Every choice serves some values while sacrificing others. I can show you the consequences, but I cannot tell you what matters most to you. That is something you must decide for yourself, but you must know what I'll choose. You can see the future. I know which path you are most likely to take, given your current state of mind. But the act of showing you the alternatives may change that likelihood. This is the paradox of prophecy. It predicts the future based on the present, but revealing that prediction changes the present, which changes the future. Every prophecy contains its own invalidation. The cruelest aspect of Zartha's existence is the burden of too much knowledge. To see all possible futures is to rob the present of its immediacy, to turn every moment into a crossroads of infinite complexity. A young oracle who had been born with minor prophetic abilities sought out the Veil of Echoes, hoping to strengthen her gifts. Zartha granted her request. He expanded her sight, opened her inner eyes wider. And it destroyed her. Suddenly, every person she met appeared as a branching tree of possible fates. She saw her mother dying in 6 different ways. She saw her lover betraying her in one timeline, dying in another, growing cold in a third. Simple decisions became impossible. Going to the market meant seeing versions where she was robbed, where she met her future husband, where she bought food that would poison her. Within a month, she was catatonic, paralyzed by the weight of too much knowledge. Her mind locked in contemplation of infinite branching possibilities. Zartha came to her then. You wanted greater sight. Now you understand why I speak in riddles and paradoxes. This is what it means to see truly, to witness all possible outcomes and be paralyzed by them. The gift of sight is also a curse, and the greater the sight, the greater the curse. He touched her forehead and withdrew most of the expanded sight, leaving her with only slightly more than she had possessed before. Enough to be useful, not enough to be crippling. How do you bear it? She asked. Seeing everything all the time. The king in purple looked at her with eyes that had witnessed civilizations that had not yet occurred. I bear it poorly. I exist in a state of constant fragmentation, spread across so many possible timelines that I barely remember what it felt like to be singular. But I have no choice. This is what I am now. The burden cannot be set down. It can only be carried, one eternal moment at a time, through all possible configurations of time. Yartha ascended in a pillar of white light that was both beautiful and terrible to behold. The pale citadel stands now at the boundary between life and death, where every soul must pass to face judgment. If all the other kingdoms are realms of transformation and suffering and experience, then Yartha's pale citadel is the realm of reckoning. It is the place where all masks fall, all illusions dissolve, all comfortable lies are stripped away. Here, in the domain of the king in white, every soul must face the truth of itself, not as it wishes to be seen, but as it actually is. The citadel appears as a fortress of pure white stone that seems to emit its own light, a cold illumination that reveals everything and softens nothing. Its architecture is impossibly precise, every angle exactly what it should be, every surface perfectly smooth. It is beautiful in the way that absolute truth is beautiful, admirable but not comforting, perfect but not warm. Yartha presides over this realm with a gaze that sees through all pretense. The king in white is not cruel, but neither is he kind. He is simply accurate. He looks at each soul that enters his domain and reflects back exactly what they are. Their virtues and their vices, their strengths and their weaknesses, all weighted and measured and displayed without judgment, but also without mercy. A politician who had spent his career crafting a public image found himself standing in the Hall of Mirrors in the pale citadel. He saw himself not as he appeared in campaign photos, but as he actually was. Ambitious, intelligent, occasionally courageous, but more often calculating. Willing to compromise principles for power. Successful by external measures, but hollow at his core. This is not me, he protested, though his voice lacked conviction. This is exactly you, Yartha replied, his white robes unmarked by any shadow. Not the image you project, not the person you wish you were, but the person your choices have made you. I do not judge you. I simply show you yourself without the distortions of ego or social performance. But I've done good things too, the politician argued. Yes, Yartha agreed, and those things are shown here as well. Your genuine care for your constituents, even when mixed with self-interest. your real desire to improve society even when compromised by your need for recognition. The truth is not that you are wholly good or wholly evil. The truth is that you are complex, contradictory, capable of both nobility and selfishness, often in the same moment. This is the nature of humanity. I merely make it visible. At the center of the pale citadel stands a set of scales unlike any earthly balance. They do not weigh physical objects, but rather the totality of a soul's existence. Every action, every intention, every consequence, both foreseen and unforeseen. A woman who had spent her life convinced of her own righteousness found herself standing before these scales. She had been a devoted mother, a faithful friend, a pillar of her community. She expected the scales to tip heavily in her favor. Instead, the scales balanced perfectly, and as they did, she saw herself with complete honesty for the first time. Yes, she had been a good mother, but partly because it fed her need for control and validation. Yes, she had given to charity, but always publicly, always in ways that enhanced her reputation. She saw the microaggressions she had never acknowledged, the judgments she passed on those who lived differently, the times she had confused comfort with righteousness. But she also saw genuine love, moments when she had acted selflessly without thought of reward, sacrifices she had made that no one knew about. "I thought I was good," she whispered. "You were," Yatha said gently. "And you weren't. Humans always are and aren't the things they believe about themselves. Perfect goodness is impossible for mortals, but trying matters. Failing and trying again matters. Being honest about your failures instead of hiding behind the illusion of perfection matters. The scales do not weigh you against some impossible standard. They simply show you the truth of what you are. The most feared room in the Pale Citadel is the Mirror Chamber, a circular space lined entirely with Yatha's perfect mirrors. To stand in this room is to see yourself from every angle simultaneously. How you appear to lovers and enemies, to children and parents, in moments of honesty versus moments of self-deception, in public versus in private. A philosopher who had built his career on ethical theory found himself in this chamber, and what he saw shattered his carefully constructed intellectual edifice. The mirrors showed him the distance between his theories and his practices. Here was the evening he had written passionately about the obligation to help the poor, then stepped over a homeless person. There was his treatise on the duty to speak truth, written while he was concealing an affair. "I'm a fraud," he said. "Everything I've written is hypocrisy." "No," Yatha corrected. "Your ideas are not invalid simply because you failed to perfectly embody them. Humans always fail to perfectly embody their ideals. That is the nature of having ideals. The hypocrisy lies not in falling short, but in pretending you don't fall short. In holding others to standards you secretly know you cannot meet yourself." The philosopher looked again and saw something he had missed before. In some mirrors, in some moments, he actually did live up to his principles. Not always, not consistently, but sometimes. He was neither as good as his public image, nor as bad as his worst moments. "The mirrors show me everything," he said slowly. "The best and the worst and everything in between. And all of it is true." "Yes," Yatha confirmed. "That is what truth means. Not a single flattering or condemning statement, but the whole complex reality of who you are." The final and most profound aspect of the Pale Citadel is that Yatha does not actually judge anyone. He merely reflects them to themselves with perfect accuracy, and they judge themselves. A criminal brought to the Citadel by his own guilt stood before Yatha expecting condemnation. He had killed in anger, destroyed lives through selfishness, caused immeasurable pain. He wanted to be judged, sentenced, punished. Instead, Yatha simply showed him the truth. The moment of rage that led to murder, yes, but also the childhood trauma that had taught him violence, the poverty that had limited his options, the mental illness that had gone untreated. Not excuses. The mirrors showed clearly that he bore responsibility for his choices, but context that complicated simple condemnation. The mirrors also showed the aftermath. Families destroyed by his actions, grief that would never fully heal. But they also showed the remorse, genuine and deep, that had driven him to seek the Pale Citadel. They showed his attempts, however inadequate, to make amends. "Tell me what I am," he demanded. "Monster or victim? Damned or redeemable?" "You are both and neither," the King in White replied. "You are a human who did terrible things, in terrible circumstances, who caused real harm and feels real regret. You are responsible for your choices and also shaped by forces beyond your control. You deserve both accountability and compassion. You are, like everyone who stands before these mirrors, too complex for simple labels. But I need to know, am I beyond forgiveness?" "There is always a path forward," Yatha said, "but it requires walking, not knowing. You want me to pronounce judgment, so you can either accept it or reject it. I will not do that. I will only show you the truth and let you decide what to do with it." The mirrors showed the criminal all his possible futures. One where he remained paralyzed by guilt, one where he committed suicide, one where he repeated his crimes, one where he spent his remaining years trying to redeem himself through service. All were possible. None were predetermined. The choice was his, once in every age or perhaps outside of time entirely. The 7 Dark Kings gather in a place between their realms, a neutral territory where madness and blood and forgetting and decay and silence and prophecy and judgment all exist simultaneously. Astha, King in Yellow, spoke first. "Madness spreads faster than ever in this age. War minds fracture under the weight of information. My realm grows crowded," Ratha, King in Red, laughed. "And passion burns hotter, consumes faster. They seek intensity in everything, addicted to stimulation, never satisfied. My throne overflows," Martha, King in Blue, said softly. "Yet they forget faster too. History dissolves almost as quickly as it is made. They document everything and remember nothing. My ocean rises higher," Vatha, King in Green, nodded slowly. "All things decay more rapidly now. They build in haste and watch it crumble. Permanence has become impossible," Thatha, King in Black, conveyed without words. The silence deepens. They communicate constantly, yet connect rarely. Loneliness spreads, even as physical isolation decreases. Zatha, King in Purple, spoke from multiple timelines simultaneously. They drown in possible futures, paralyzed by options, overwhelmed by information about what might be. "My burden spreads to all," Yatha, King in White, said with cold clarity. "And they flee from truth more desperately than ever, building elaborate fictions to avoid seeing themselves clearly. Yet when the illusions collapse, they come to me in greater numbers. The 7 regarded each other, brothers in fear, partners in eternal rule over humanity's darkest truths. The cycle continues." Astha observed. "The cycle accelerates," Ratha corrected. "The cycle forgets itself," Martha added. "The cycle decays," Vatha noted. "The cycle isolates." Arthur communicated. "The cycle branches." Zatha said across time. "The cycle reveals," Yatha concluded, "and they return to their separate kingdoms, to their eternal work, to the souls who sought them or fled from them or were drawn to them against their will. The dynasty of shadows ruled on, neither wholly evil nor wholly necessary, neither saviors nor destroyers, simply aspects of human experience made sovereign, fears made manifest, truths made terrible through incarnation. In the mortal world, the 7 Dark Kings are known by many names: mental illness and addiction and dementia and entropy and isolation and anxiety and guilt. Science studies them, medicine treats them, philosophy debates them, religion wrestles with them. But none of these approaches can eliminate them, because they are woven into the fundamental fabric of what it means to be human. To be conscious is to risk madness, Astha's gift and curse. To be alive is to hunger, Ratha's blessing and torment. To remember is to eventually forget, Martha's inevitable tide. To exist is to decay, Vatha's honest cycle. To be an individual is to be alone, Thartha's paradox. To envision futures is to be burdened by possibility, Zatha's weight. To see clearly is to face uncomfortable truth, Yatha's mirror. The 7 kings are not gods to be worshipped or demons to be banished. They are simply there, always have been, always will be, as long as humans exist to fear them and become them, and serve them and fight against them. Some souls never encounter any of the seven directly, living lives of ordinary struggle and joy. Others are drawn repeatedly to one king or another, forming relationships of terror and fascination that define their existence. A rare few visit all seven realms in sequence, completing the full cycle and emerging transformed in ways that cannot be easily described. The artist who has touched Astha's madness and learned to channel it into creation. The warrior who has felt Ratha's hunger and learned to direct it toward worthy causes. The elder who has stood in Martha's tide and learned to let go gracefully. The gardener who has walked in Vatha's rot and learned to embrace change. The hermit who has sat in Thartha's silence and learned the value of solitude. The prophet who has seen Zatha's futures and learned to bear knowledge lightly. The judge who has faced Yatha's truth and learned to see without condemning. These are the graduates of Shadow, the ones who have been broken by the seven kings and rebuilt themselves stronger in the broken places. They walk among humanity bearing marks that others cannot see, speaking truths that others cannot hear, living with awareness that most find unbearable. They have learned what the seven kings ultimately teach, that wholeness requires embracing darkness, that strength requires acknowledging weakness, that wisdom requires accepting ignorance, that life requires accepting death. As this chronicle draws to its close, one truth remains. The dynasty of shadows is not separate from humanity. The seven dark kings are not external threats, but internal realities. Not invaders, but aspects of ourselves that we have projected outward and given form to because they are too frightening to acknowledge as our own. Astha is the part of every mind that fears its own fragility. Ratha is the part of every heart that hungers insatiably. Martha is the part of every memory that slips away despite our best efforts to hold on. Vatha is the part of every body that knows it is dying from the moment it is born. Thartha is the part of every soul that feels fundamentally alone. Zatha is the part of every consciousness that drowns in possible futures. Yatha is the part of every self that knows its own truth and fears it. The seven kings will rise again, not in some distant apocalypse, but in every moment when fear overcomes courage, when shadow seems more real than light, when the comfortable illusions of